So my lecture builds on the concept that space, memorialization, and the so-called discourse of place played a central role in shaping religious and sectarian identities in early Islam. And so I will offer a preliminary exploration of some early Shia strategies that I argue serve to emphasize communal distinctiveness in the public space, and also to somehow reappropriate the topography of shared sacred building. I've chosen two case studies in particular to examine, which coincides with two of the most significant buildings of early Islam, namely the Mosque of the Prophet in Medina and the Great Mosque of Kufa. And I would like to start with a few words on my methodology, because as it is known, both of these structures share a critical lack of archaeological data, which therefore has led studies to be conducted with no or very little focus on the topographic realities of these sites. Nevertheless, as I will show during the lecture, both buildings, because of their spatial status, of their very special status in Islam, show a marked tendency to preserve, to varying degrees, the layout of their early Islamic phases within their later architectural fabric. And so this phenomenon, which I termed architectural conservatism, has exceptional potential for reconstructing their spatial and architectural histories, although it has yet to be acknowledged or harnessed really by modern scholarship. So I'm going to start with Medina. So here, as you can see from this recent satellite picture, the city's historical landscape has been almost entirely erased in the last couple of decades, and the Prophet Mosque, which is the building in the middle here, has undergone several significant expansions that have radically altered its original appearance. So in order to cope with this lack of data, I have analyzed textual sources, and especially the early local histories of the city, hand in hand with the available historical visual documentation on the city and the mosque, which include declassified satellite imagery, diagrammatic maps, cartographic material, and also devotional illustrations from the 10th century to the late Ottoman era. So this body of data gave me an idea of the city and of the building of the mosque before the last Saudi expansion. So I anchored all the data obtained from these two data sets using CAD and GIS technology to the earliest scientific planimetric diagram of the mosque, and georeferenced it onto a current map of the city. And through this process, it became very clear that the post-medieval fabric of the mosque had preserved the precise layout of the Umayyad and prophetic structures. So this focus on spatial geography provides a very decisive, an important framework for assessing the reliability of the traditions about the topography of the building and its surroundings in the early Islamic period, and in particular, for what concerns this specific lecture, proves instrumental in exposing fabricated topographies. And this in turn allows us to investigate how the image of a city or of a particular structure within it can be manipulated, and how a discourse of place can be constructed to serve a specific political or sectarian agenda. The most significant section of the Prophet's Mosque is the so-called Rauda, which is a section of the building named after a famous hadith of the saying of the Prophet that extends, as you can see here, more or less between the minbar of the Prophet and the so-called Noble Hujra which is the burial chamber of the Prophet, which originally was part of the dwelling quarters of Aisha. So just north of the Hujra, there is a site which is identified with the house of Fatima, where the daughter of the Prophet allegedly lived with her husband and children, and where she was ultimately buried. So we know that the site of the Bight of Fatima was fully integrated into the circuit of Ziyara to the Prophet's Mosque by the late 16th century, because it appears as a prominent site in several Ottoman miniatures of the Prophet's Mosque. And in these examples that I selected that come from the Süleymaniye Library in Istanbul, you can even see in some of them, like here, or particularly here, the smudged ink, which reveals that these particular pictures served as a support for mental ziyara, with the devotees tracing the recommended visitation routes with their fingers directly on the page. Furthermore, beside this, from the account of Ibn Jubair, who visited the mosque in the 12th century, we know that the site was already revered and visited by pilgrims by that time, although he reports that there was some disagreement over its identification already in his own time. So I decided to take a closer look at the early local histories of Medina to find out more about when this site started to crystallize. So the earliest association of the area north of the Hujra with Fatima appears in an account by Omar ibn Shabba, who recorded that, as you can read, Ali married Fatima at the column behind the column facing the Zur, and this door was at the square which is in the tomb. Sulaiman bin Salim al-Attar, Muslim said, "Do not forget your share of good fortune in praying toward it, for it is the door of Fatima through which Ali used to enter to see her. I have seen Hassan bin Zaid praying toward it." So the special details given in this tradition can be clarified thanks to this diagram of the mosque, of the Hujra, which was originally found in the manuscript of the Akhbar Medina by Umar ibn Shabba, which Al-Samhudi copied in the 16th century. So although this picture is preserved only as a 16th century copy, it can be regarded as the earliest diagrammatic representation of the tomb of the Prophet, which would become a recognized genre of Islamic sacred topographic iconography. So what Ibn Shabba calls the Zur is the triangular space that abuts the northern wall of the Hujra, and as for the square which is in the tomb, that is the quadrangular plinth that used to adjoin the northwestern corner of the Hujra and mark the corner of the Sahn, of the courtyard of the mosque in the Umayyad period. So according to this narrative, the house of Fatima stood immediately adjacent to the house of Aisha. It is particularly notable and important that this report links the association of this very site with Fatima to a specific ritual practice performed by Hassan ibn Zaid ibn Hassan, who was a great-grandson of Ali bin Abi Talib, who served as the governor of Medina under Al-Mansur, so in the second half of the 8th century. Therefore, the earliest surviving link between this spot and Fatima appears to stem from the commemorative practice of a prominent Alid figure in the latter half of the 8th century. At the same time, however, contemporary sources display disagreement regarding the precise location of the house of Fatima and their grave. The same Ibn Shabba elsewhere in his book reports with a chain of transmitter that goes back to Jafar al-Sadiq and Muhammad al-Baqir, who are respectively the sixth and the fifth imams of the Imamiyya, that Ali buried Fatima at night in her house that was included in the mosque. And her tomb is at the door of the mosque that faces the door of Asma bint Hussein bint Ubaydallah bin Abbas. So if we plot these coordinates onto the face plans of the mosque, we can observe that this location is shifted roughly 20 meters north of the previous site. So in fact, the Dar of Asma was one of the residential courts adjoining the Mosque of the Prophet in the Abbasid period. And we know that it stood directly in front one of the gates of the mosque that was immediately north of the Bab al-Niza. And another thing that should be noted is that this very site falls well outside the boundaries of the mosque in the time of the Prophet. And this second location, like the first one, also relies on Shīʿī notes, whereas in contrast, a tradition recorded in the near contemporary Al-Adab al-Mufrad by al-Bukhari implies that Fatima's house laid well outside the boundaries of the Prophet's mosque, as it relates about the Prophet walking to the souk of the Banu Qaynuqa and sitting in the courtyard of the Bayt of Fatima, waiting for Hussein to come out. But the souk of the Banu Qaynuqa was a well-known market in Medina, located near the crossing of the Wadi Budhan, roughly 500 meters southwest of the Mosque of the Prophet. And so significantly, Muhammad is known to have owned lands in this area, which makes it plausible that Fatima and her family had lived there rather than in the crowded neighborhood near the mosque. So in fact, going back to the two locations of the Bayt of Fatima at the mosque, the first one at the Dar and Bab of Asma, and the second one north of the Ujra, they both present some topographical challenges if we consider them in the broader context of the prophetic household. As we saw, the second site fell well outside the boundaries of the Prophet's mosque, so it was not in prominent position beside the mosque as some of the sources say. Whereas the second one, it would have taken up a considerable portion of the living quarters of the wives of the Prophet, which we know were comprised between the eastern wall of the mosque, which ran here at the fifth column to the east of the minbar, and the Dar of Uthman, which we can locate securely because we know that it was located in the place of what later became the Ribat al-Hajam that is indicated in the Ottoman maps of Medina. This area covered roughly 300 square meters. And furthermore, beside this, the site of the Bayt of Fatima happens to overlap with the site of the Bayt of Sauda, one of the wives of the Prophet, as reported by Al-Zuhri, an author writing in the first half of the 8th century. So Al-Zuhri is among the earliest sources describing the layout of the prophetic dwelling quarters, and this circumstance suggests therefore that the association of this very site with Fatima might have started to solidify and crystallize only after Al-Zuhri was writing, so after the first half of the 8th century. And further hints that this may indeed be the case emerge from the debate that is closely related to this, over the location of the tomb of Fatima. So according to several 9th century traditions, Fatima was buried at Al-Baqi al-Gharqad, which is a burial ground in the eastern outskirts of Medina, on land associated with the residential court or dar of Aqil bin Abi Talib, the brother of Ali. So remarkably, that very site is also associated with, by various reports, to a dar of Ali himself, placed in at Al-Baqi, which was still extant apparently in the 9th century and was situated just in close proximity with the Dar of Aqil. So the claim that Fatima's graves was at Al-Baqi, if it's considered in the light of the textual evidence attesting to the existence of this Dar of Ali there, and with the tradition that she was buried in her own house, collectively suggests that Ali and Fatima may have actually resided in Al-Baqi. So, in this concern, it's significant that this Dar of Ali seems to have formed the nucleus of an early Talibid district that comprised the houses of other important members of the Alid family in Medina, including some Shia imams, such as Zain al-Abidin, but also Muhammad al-Baqir. So the upshot of all of this, however, is that the location of the house of Fatima and her tomb remained highly contested well into the 9th century. In fact, it appears that the authority who was instrumental in crystallizing the site of the Bait of Fatima north of the Hujra was Yahya al-Akiki, a Talibid from Medina, who authored one of the earliest local histories of the city. Yahya's work exhibits clear pro-Shi'i tendencies, and he is the source for all the narratives linking the area north of the Hujra, the area of the Zur that we saw earlier, with Fatima's Bait. And he's also the source for a number of accounts that frame the proximity of the house of Fatima and the Prophet in an eschatological perspective. And interestingly enough, Yahya describes this particular section of the Umayyad building also as having been dotted with further tangible and intangible vestiges memorializing the Ahl al-Bayt, such as a stone near the square pillar that you can see here, allegedly obliterated when al-Mutawakkil paved the area around the Prophet's tomb with marble, where Fatima allegedly gave birth to Hussein and Hassan, or the so-called column of the guard that you can see here, that according to Yahya was the place where Ali sat to watch over the Prophet. So the retrospective nature of the accounts associating this column with Ali becomes particularly evident when we consider that the location of the column falls exactly on the eastern boundary of the prophetic mosque, and also that this tradition reports that Ali used to sit on the flat surface of its plinth. However, we know that the columns of the mosque were provided with square plinth only following the Umayyad reconstruction, while it is universally maintained by all the sources that during the time of the Prophet, the prayer hall was supported by palm tree trunks. So this is an important indicator that the Alid sacred topography of the Prophet's mosque was imagined upon the material reality of the Umayyad building and back projected onto the prophetic realm. Interestingly, a saying by al-Akshahari, another writing in the early 14th century, we know that in his own time, the Umara of Medina used to perform their prayers facing this very column, which over time had gained recognition as the Musalla or prayer spot of Ali. So this reveals that during the Ubaid era, when the Imami families in Medina had assumed control over the Mosque of the Prophet, the site of the column of the guard and conceivably other early components of the Ali topography within the mosque had garnered exceptional significance to the point of becoming the focal points of Shiite liturgy in that epoch. So this phenomenon speaks for the enduring importance of the elements composing this devotional landscape in affirming, maintaining, and performing the sectarian identity of Shia groups within the shared space of the Mosque of the Prophet during the centuries. And a look at the Imami Hadith corpus can, in fact, lend support and nuance to this hypothesis. So in Al-Kafi by Al-Kulaini, the identification of the Bait of Fatima at the mosque and its veneration is highlighted by the actions and advice of the Shia imams and several reports attributed to Jafar as-Sadiq that you can read here. Establish its definitely location at the Zur, north of the Hujra. And in this concern, it should be noted that Jafar as-Sadiq featured in Ibn Shabbas' work as the authority for locating the Bait at the Bab Asma, which suggests that the tradition recorded by Al-Kulani postdated the final crystallization of this northern side, in which, as I suggested, Yahya al-Akiki seems to have been instrumental toward the end of the 9th century. Furthermore, the striking precision of these accounts implies that they serve a practical function for imamis in the 10th century who were visiting the Prophet's mosque, enabling them to pinpoint the site with accuracy and perform salat there. So this idea that the site was tied to Imami Shīʿī prayer in the Prophet's mosque finds support in several other hadiths in which Jafar as-Sadiq claims that prayer at the spot of Fatima's house is more meritorious than prayer anywhere else in the Rauda, so in the sacred place of the mosque, is this most sacred spot of the most sacred section of the most sacred building, basically, in Medina. And we have at least other two traditions that support the idea that praying there had become an accepted and widespread Imami practice, at least by the 10th century. So long narrative reported in Al-Kafi, which I only quoted a passage here, provides an indirect account that the Shia Imam al-Jawad was believed to have routinely performed his prayers at as the site of Fatima's Bait, and a further tradition by Ibn Babawai records that by the time of his writing, the ziyara to the tomb of Fatima had become fully integrated into the Imami Hajj itinerary, as they say that he goes to visit the site after he performed the Hajj to Mecca. So in conclusion, I believe that these traditions clearly reveal the intention to encourage the followers of the Imam, whenever they were in the Prophet's mosque in Medina, to perform prayer at the site of Fatima's Bait rather than elsewhere there. So the identification of this site, its crystallization into the material topography of the Umayyad mosque, can be seen, in my opinion, as aimed at promoting a distinctive ritual practice within the shared space of the mosque as a way to assert and perform communal belonging and identity. So, turning to the second case study, Kufa, its great mosque, as it's known, occupies a very prominent position within the framework of Shiite sacred spaces in the early Islamic period, but also later. So I will try to show now in the second part of the lecture that much like in Medina, the early Shiite community there established and projected a distinctive sacred microtopography onto the fabric of the Umayyad era mosque. So sometimes that needs to be pointed out is that differently from Medina, some archaeological evidence does exist in Kufa for the mosque, although it is rather limited for this building compared to the adjacent Qasr al-Imara, which was fully excavated and published. So today, as you can see from this picture, the Mosque of Kufa is a lavish new building following a recent reconstruction financed by the Woody Bahra in the, I think in 2010, it was completed. And so while nothing remains of the original historical structure of the mosque, abundant photographic documentation was preserved in a rare booklet published in 1940 by the State Board of Antiquities and Heritage in Iraq. So from the publication, from these photos and the plan, it can be inferred that the building in the 40s featured a perimeter wall with abutting round towers measuring roughly 110 by 116 meters per side, which enclosed a large open courtyard bordered by rows of arches on all sides and notably lacked a column prayer hall. So this layout contrasts with historical accounts about Masjid al-Kufa, which describe the building as having boasted a monumental prayer hall supported by exceptionally high stone columns. So in fact, a passage in the Bihar by Al-Majlisi reveals that who is the source of the Safavid period, reveals that the Mosque of Kufa had already lost its column prayer hall probably long before the 17th century when he was writing. So the account is particularly remarkable in its archaeological accurateness and describes some clearing works during which the floor level of the building was cleared from the debris and excavated to a depth of 2 cubits, which is approximately 1 meter, revealing an older floor marked by the remains of column bases arranged into bays and connected to a monumental central mihrab. So this evidence suggests that sometimes before the Safavid period, the columns of the Umayyad mosque fell. The floor of the building was raised by about 1 meter due to accumulation of debris and trampling, and a new wall at some point was constructed atop the remnants of the original wall. This circumstance, interestingly enough, was confirmed by archaeological excavation, which revealed that the perimeter walls of the mosque were constructed over the ancient, namely the Umayyad perimeter of the building, and evidence of this architectural stratigraphy and its periodization can be also inferred from a report discussing an Ilkhanid period bath found in the palace, abutting the wall of the Qasr, the northern wall, which corresponds to the Qibli wall of the mosque, because the two buildings are built alongside each other. So as you can see from this excavation photograph, we can notice a sharp change in the quality of the masonry at a level of about 2 meters from the Ilkhanid floor level. So we can see that the wide and very regular bricks set in thick layers of mortar give way to smaller bricks on top, and which tells us that this section of the wall corresponds to a new building phase of the mosque, during which also the door used in the Ilkhanid period to go from the bath into the mosque directly was blocked out. So the key takeaway from this is that the Umayyad mosque described by medieval sources remained in use well into the 13th century, and even after that date, despite significant changes to its inner layout, it retained its original location, size, and orientation from the Umayyad period. So this enables relatively precise tracking and georeferencing of the boundaries of the Umayyad building, and moreover, additional information for reconstructing its inner layout can be gleaned from written sources. So the already quoted Ibn Jubayr, who visited Kufa after Medina in 1184, describes the building as a great mosque with a prayer hall comprising 5 aisles of extremely tall columns made of hard carved stones, supporting a flat roof. And he observes a very close similarity between the prayer hall of the Mosque of Kufa with the prayer hall of the Mosque of the Prophet in Medina. And just as in the Prophet's Mosque, he says that the remaining 3 sides were covered by 2 riwaqs, so 2 porticos per side. And the above mentioned passage by Majlisi allows us to complete the picture of the building, because as we saw, the Umayyad Mosque, which was buried about 1 meter below the Safavid floor level, featured an old concave mihrab connected to the original pavement, which also showed the remains of columns placed at regular intervals, except in front of the mihrab, where the spacing doubled, creating a wider aisles just in front of the prayer niche, which is a typical late Umayyad Marwanid feature, which was designed to emphasize visually the mihrab in the mosque space. So we don't know exactly how many columns stood in these 5 rows, but based on the indication of Ibn Jubayr that they supported a flat roof without arches like the Mosque of the Prophet in Medina, I have speculatively set their spacing at a regular interval of 4.9 meters, which corresponds to the average intercolumn of the Mosque of the Prophet, but also of the almost contemporary mosque at Wazit, which is the oldest archaeological attested mosque known to us. So this spacing allowed us to estimate around 20 columns per row in the prayer hall, as you can see here. For what concerns the doors of the mosque, we know that the Mosque of Kufa had several doors, but only 4 can be located with relative accuracy, and they are the Bab Sudda, which was positioned near in the Qibli wall near the corner of the mosque. We then have the Bab Kinda, which was located in the western wall, a few meters south of the corner, the Bab al-Anmat also on the western wall, to the north of the Bab Kinda, and the Bab al-Fil on the northern wall, just in front of the Bab Sudda. So now, having established locations of the doors and pillars of the Umayyad structure, we can use these as a platform to trace back the Imami sacred topography of the Great Mosque of Kufa and anchor these locations to physical locations in space. So thanks to several traditions preserved in the Imami Hadith corpus, and especially in the already mentioned Al-Kafi by Al-Kulaini, we know that the early Shia placed particular emphasis on certain pillars within the mosque. So some traditions attributed to the 12 Imams provide detailed instructions intended to precisely identify these sacred locations, like in the case of Medina. So the relevant traditions state that, as you can read here, for instance, Emir al-Mu'minin used to pray towards the 7th column from the Bab Kinda. Abu Abdallah, who is Jafar as-Sadiq, said, when you enter from the 2nd gate on the right side of the mosque, count 5 columns, 2 of which are in the Zulla and 3 in the Sakhn. At the third is the Maqam of Ibrahim, which is the fifth from the wall, and Abu Abdallah said the same, Jafar as-Sadiq, that the seventh pillar from what joins the Bab Kinda in the Sahn is the Maqam of Ibrahim, and the fifth is the Maqam of Jibra'il. And again, Azbag ibn Bata, a companion of Ali, said to the transmitter that the seventh column was the maqam of the Amir al-Mu'minin, and he said that Al-Hassan bin Ali used to pray at the fifth one, namely the fifth column, and when the Amir al-Mu'minin was absent, Al-Hassan would pray at it, so at the seventh, and it is counting from Bab Kinda. So at first glance, these indications might appear confusing, but if we look at the plan of the mosque, they actually become quite straightforward, because if we enter from the Bab Kinda and we can't proceed eastward along the Sahn, and we count 5 columns, the first 2 are situated within the Riwak, so in the Zulla, in the shaded area, as Jafar Sadiq said, while the following 3 face the courtyard. So of these, the third, which is also the fifth from the wall, is identified as a special maqam, connected in certain traditions to Jibra'il, and known as the place where Hassan ibn Ali used to pray. 2 columns further east, at the 7th column from the Bab Kinda, lies another revered relic. So although the 2 reports attributed to Jafar are inconsistent because they place the Maqam Ibrahim first at the 5th and then at the 7th column, that doesn't matter very much, because what is clear is that the 7th column held a particular significance, and it was associated with the Amir al-Mu'minin himself, so with Ali. So given this evidence, it seems likely that this specific area in the Mosque of Kufa would have served as a natural gathering point for the followers of the Imams, and possibly for the Imams themselves in the 9th and 10th century, if not earlier, whenever they would find themselves in the Mosque of Kufa. So it is interesting that the position of the 2 columns that we identified correspond roughly to a line of pillars depicted in the earliest surviving plan of the Mosque of Kufa, drawn by the German explorer Carsten Niebuhr in 1764. So this suggests that even long after the mosque had lost its prayer hall, the memory of these sites was actively preserved and perpetuated. In fact, it's interesting that the passage of, again, in Al-Majlisi's Bihar confirms that in the late 17th century, so only a few decades before Niebuhr visited Medina, the location of certain ancient columns of the prayer hall in the row of the 5th and the 7th columns remained clearly recognizable, even though some of them had toppled. So as evidence of the remarkable topographic conservatism surrounding these architectural features, it is especially notable that actually the same 2 locations align almost precisely with two of the mihrabs depicted in the plan published by the State Board of Antiquities in Iraq in the 40s. And the report interestingly indicates that the mihrab matching the 5th column bore an inscription reading this is the 5th column, and this is on the one side, and the Maqam Jibra'il on the other side, which demonstrates that the memory of this athar, this location, was preserved with a striking spatial accuracy. And although the report doesn't identify explicitly the other mihrab, we can conclude, based on the previous evidence, that it corresponded to the 7th column and the Maqam of Ibrahim. As for the 3rd mihrab that you can see here, this is to mark a spot associated with the 4th 12th Imam, Zain al-Abidin, which, according to the documented description, was linked to the position of the third column of the prayer hall. Another rebel location mentioned in Shia sources, and that was situated near the same spot, is the Tanur, the oven from which the waters of the flood are said to have gushed during the time of Noah. And this site is the central component of the discourse developed by Imami sources, which sought to integrate the Masjid al-Kufa into a broader biblical narrative and amplify its charisma within the network of holy sites in Kufa and Iraq in general. So based on this, we can say that the area of the mosque adjoining its southwest corner and the Bab Kinda was reclaimed and reappropriated by the Shia community through the projection of a micro-sacred topography onto the physical structure of the building, so mirroring the process that we have observed for Medina. So the choice of this particular area is not better clarified in the sources, but appears closely related to a distinctive Shia belief, which was discussed by Najam Haider, that associates the right side of the mosque with positive and paradisiacal qualities, as opposed to its left side, which was endowed with deceit and evil machination, or makar. So a tradition reported by Abu Basir sheds light on this spatial dichotomy, because it says that the residences of ruling power, Manazil al-Sultan, stood on the mosque's left side, which is almost certainly a reference intended for the Umayyad Qasr al-Imara, which, as archaeology revealed, was located along the Qibli side of the mosque, offset roughly 25 meters to its east, namely to its left side if one looks toward the Qibla. On the other side, the reason underlying the special sanctity of the attributed to the right side are not provided by any surviving tradition. However, if we look again at the wider context, we can observe that the right or western side of the mosque, and specifically the section where all the Shiite relics are clustered, face the section of the Qibli wall, which was left unobstructed by the Qasr, and this section happens to border an open area extending south of the mosque, which is known today as the Rahba of Ali, which extends near a small building here that the local lore identifies as the house of Ali, the Bait Imam Ali. So although the Bait itself is a relatively recent building, textual evidence demonstrates that the connection of this particular area to the Amir al-Mu'minin is remarkably long-standing, going back at least to the early 9th century. As it is documented in a passage from the Tabaqat of Ibn Sa'ad, which states that Ali settled in Kufa in the Rahaba of Ali in the Akhsas there, whereas Akhsas, according to Lane, refers to houses roofed with a piece of wood in the form of an oblong vaulted structure. And in fact, interestingly, the existence of the Rahba and its association with Ali can be traced even earlier, because it appears in the description of the Tamsir of Kufa by Said ibn Umar, who was writing actually in the 8th century. So therefore, I propose here that the location of the Rahba and the Bait of Ali was directly connected to the special virtues ascribed by the Shia to the right side of the mosque. And in this very regard, it is particularly significant that numerous accounts dating as far back as the 9th century identify the Rahba as one of the potential locations for the tomb of Ali. So, for instance, al-Baladuri and al-Isfahani explicitly state that Ali was buried in Kufa near the Congregational Mosque, in Al-Rahba, close to the Kinda Gate. So precisely in proximity to the cluster of Shīʿī sacred relics that we have reconstructed. So in this light, the particular veneration by the Twelver Shīʿī community for the area around the southwestern corner of the mosque, and more generally, the paradisiacal qualities attributed to the mosque's right side, mainly have been influenced or directly prompted by the proximity of an area historically associated with the Amir al-Mu'minin, and which some channels of the tradition identified also as the site of his burial, at least until Najaf was eventually established as such. So to conclude, through these two case studies, I have tried to shed light on the way in which the early Shīʿī community in Kufa and Medina reclaimed portions of the great mosques that had been appropriated by the Umayyads through their lavish rebuilding projects, by overlaying these spaces with a distinctive Shiite sacred topography. So the knowledge, recognition, and veneration of this topography and clustering around it during visits to the mosque or during private services may have served as a crucial marker of communal belonging, and also as an important performative element in shaping a sense of distinctiveness and sectarian identity for the early Shia. And thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your comments and questions.